Fabulous. So thanks everybody for logging in, for clicking, for sharing some of your time with me online. What I would like to do today is to talk a little bit about this global pandemic that we're all living in. From the perspective of media and mass communication theory. Specifically, what can media mass communication theory do to help us understand, study, appreciate of what's going on? And I do say this with due respect to the fact that, of course, with media scholarship, we cannot cure people, we cannot relieve the suffering of people who are right now in the hospital or are infected by this virus. On the other hand, it is fascinating, and I will be returning to this a lot during my talk, that the World Health Organization, as well as UNESCO, have come out this week with, and this month, with statements suggesting that the pandemic of the coronavirus is equal to what they call the infodemic or disinfodemic of the role of media. So in other words, how we experience and use media is just as dangerous, they say, as the pandemic itself. And this is a rather profound statement, and especially for us as media scholars and students should get all the hairs on our back stand up straight, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? How can a virus be the same in terms of danger as what people do with media? So I'll talk a little bit about that, or a lot about that, and I think this statement such as that in itself warrants our dedicated attention. So most of my talk is informed by a book that is about to come out. I can also show you the actual book. It's got a lot of pages. It's the new edition of Dennis McQuail's Media Mass Communication Theory. Dennis was a good friend of mine. He passed away 2 years ago, as you may or may not know. This book, he started the first version of this book in the 1960s. And now, of course, in a 7th edition, this book has been part of the foundation of media and mass communication scholarship around the world. It was my Bible. When I became a PhD student, I'd never studied media and mass communication. So I read this book first and got horribly confused. Then I started teaching it, and I've been doing that for the last 20 years. And fell in love, and so it was a tremendous honor for me to take over this book from him, to work with him in the last years before his death, and now to be able to publish a new edition, and hopefully the upcoming editions as well. So I will use this book as the basis for what I'm talking about. And I guess what is first and foremost interesting in all of this is that when we talk about the role of media in society or media and mass communication, we first have to have this debate about, of course, what are we actually talking about? And more importantly, perhaps, can we still talk about mass media and mass communication in society? I mean, are these concepts still valid when everybody is sitting there all alone on their device, typing away or scrolling or swiping, or is that still mass media? Is that still mass communication? And interestingly, that debate has been going on for at least 40 years, right? The earliest publications in our field saying that, oh, we cannot use mass comm anymore, appeared in the 1980s, well before the internet, well before, or at least before the World Wide Web, well before mobile phones and smartphones, of course, well before social media. So this is an old debate in our field. And generally you could argue that what typifies our field now is that its origins are very much about the study of communication from a mass perspective, right? And the original studies of media and communication were always about the impact that mass media messages had on the masses, the public. Those were the foundational studies in our field from the 1920s on to the 1950s and 60s. And only much later did we start to develop an appreciation of how people in social groups or even on an individual level do unique things and make sense in unique ways of their media. And that it actually makes a difference who the individual mass communicator is, in what kind of messages he or she makes, and how we then use these messages. And now, with the internet and the global digital economy and with living in a network society, you could argue that these old concerns about mass media and mass communication have collapsed with the newer communication concerns of interpersonal communication and what Manuel Castells calls mass self-communication. So in other words, everything today is a form of mass communication, either deliberately, where somebody sends a message to potentially everyone, or involuntary, because when we use any kind of digital device, we are sending information to millions out there, most of which aren't human beings, but robots, right? Software that takes our data and our messages and our identity information and uses that in all kinds of different ways. So everything is mass communication. That's the point that I'm departing from in my talk, in my observations. That has a whole range of implications that are all incredibly fun to pursue. That's what that book is for. What I'll do today is to apply them, some of these basic insights to the coronavirus pandemic. What I want to do is use our book, which was, as you can, sorry, that side, a part of the whole history of books that Dennis made. In all these books, he has documented, and now in a new edition, I've updated this documentation, a range of fundamental theories about media and society. Sort of the theories that have informed and shaped our research and studies over the last 100 years. And he boils it down to 6 fundamental theories. In the new edition, I've added the 7th one, a new one that has emerged in the last 10 years since the last edition of McQuill's book came out. 7 fundamental theories that he says that have shaped and informed the fundamental approaches and research and theory in our field, and therefore to some extent explain why we know what we know when we talk with each other about media and about communication. So I want to apply very briefly these 7 theories to the global pandemic. The first one of these theories is the mass society theory. The notion, and this of course is from the earliest beginnings of media and communication scholarship, when there was no media studies or communication science. We're talking about the 1920s and 1930s, when sociologists, economists, psychologists, anthropologists were interested in what the emergence of a mass society was doing to people. What was happening as millions of people all over the world started moving towards these sprawling cities, working in factories, creating this giant machine that is, of course, the contemporary modern society. And the media in this theory were considered as a causal factor in explaining what people were doing and how they were affected by the messages directly sent to them. People were a mass of atomized individuals, not really able or capable to make sense of anything outside of themselves other than through the mass media of the day. What we see in the current debates about the pandemic is that concerns about misinformation and disinformation, about fake news, about lies and rumors and all those kind of things circulating online are very much still inspired by this old idea of the mass as a bunch of atomized individuals, disconnected from each other, blind to each other, you would almost say, and directly exposed, and even in a linear way, to the messages of media, whether those media are, institutionalized news media, government official statements, or, somebody's Facebook status update. And so I'm not dismissing concerns about misinformation, but the fact that we are so concerned about it is very much inspired by one of the oldest theories of our field. And interestingly, the Reuters Institute just came out this week with a report showing that in 6 countries, vast majority of people don't hardly ever see any so-called misinformation. If they do see it, they don't trust it. That the majority of people trust experts and scientists. And then a long time nothing, and then they'll trust a couple of journalists, and a long time nothing, and then they trust ordinary people. Because the people spreading these kind of information campaigns, misinformation, are ordinary people, generally speaking. So it's interesting how our concern about this misinformation or this infodemic is very much inspired by a 100-year-old perspective. That doesn't mean I'm dismissing it. It's an important perspective and an important concern, but it is a century old. Now, you could argue, well, hey, I mean, you can't say that we're a mass of atomized individuals anymore. Hey, we're all connected, right? We're being lectured to by a guy in the UK who works in Amsterdam, and we're all in our pajamas in Lisboa. That's true. We're all connected. We're not atomized in that sense. On the other hand, I sometimes wonder whether we are not still atomized, but in a different way. We used to be atomized as receivers of information, but now we're all atomized as senders, right? We are, all of us, more busy on a day-to-day basis with sending information to the world rather than sitting down and quietly consuming. And so our atomization occurs when everybody's speaking and therefore nobody's listening to each other anymore. Something to think about. A second fundamental theory, I'm in his way, generally attributed to Karl Marx, but belonging to a whole host of theorists and economists writing in the late 19th and early 19th century, early 20th century, and the last 20 years absolutely reviving, is the theory of political economy. The notion that there's a direct relationship between political power and economic status. So when we apply this to the media, you could argue that the rise of media institutions and corporations around the world coincide not just with economic power, as in, you know, Rupert Murdoch and people like him earning lots of money, but more specifically with political power, with power to set the agenda, to influence what's happening on a national and international basis. And this political economy theory is very much present in all kinds of critical analysis right now of, for example, the way news organizations, established legacy news organizations around the world, choose to cover the pandemic. The argument is, for example, that what news organizations tend to do is one-on-one copying and pasting whatever people in charge are saying, and admonishing everybody to hashtag stay at home, to listen to the instructions of the experts, to flatten the curve, and those kind of things. And the argument is that all of this coverage is very based on, driven by consensus, it's patriotic, it's nationalistic even, and where are critical voices, right? Where are different perspectives? Where is the hard-hitting investigative journalism that, and this is what political economy inspired critiques would argue. Funnily enough, those same critics from this political economy perspective that look at journalists as operating in the service of dominant power in society, and therefore, for example, not reporting on all the profound inequalities that are amplified by the current situation, by everybody now expecting to be online and doing everything from home, which huge numbers of the population, especially those already marginalized, cannot afford or cannot participate in. Those same critics would expect from journalists a much more neutral, dispassionate, factual approach. They say journalists should report the facts, should not, you know, be slaves to the corporation, to power, and they should be autonomous and dispassionate and all of that. And when I read critiques like that, I'm often wondering, to what extent do we appreciate that journalists today are in an incredibly difficult position in that they report on trauma that they also experiencing, which is cover, but that they also feel. And it is interesting, it was mentioned earlier that one of my recent books that I was very privileged to write with Tamara Witska, a lifelong friend of mine and a colleague from the University of Groningen, on startups, journalistic startups all over the world. And I've been following these startups and their coverage of the pandemic. And what you see there, perhaps a bit more than in traditional news organizations, is an emphasis on this emotion. Very personal stories of reporters individually, but also just an appreciation of how individual people are experiencing this trauma, these events, and those kind of stories. And of course, you see these stories in traditional media as well. But it is interesting to see that these journalists operating outside of the mainstream seem to be embracing much more of that, at least from a from a personal observation standpoint. There are many other theories that we discuss in the book, fundamental theories about the role of media in society. One important one is functionalism. Now, functionalism is a sociological theory that originally explained a lot of our concern and our research into media. The reason is that from a functionalist perspective, you assume that what society ultimately strives for is some kind of fit, some kind of equilibrium. So society as an organic whole. And different systems in society fulfill different functions that together make up our world and how it works. And the media, in other words, their primary function in this is sort of to keep it all together. You may have heard journalists sometimes talking about themselves as providing society with social cement, right? That the reason why our media are always national media, and there's hardly any truly international media, is because our media is looking inward and keeping a society together. From a functionalist perspective, that is perfectly understandable. A functionalist perspective also assumes that there's never actually a perfect society. It's not that society at some point works wonderfully well, where everybody does what he or she is supposed to do. No, rebellion and protest and conflict are intrinsic elements in making a society work. And I think a functionalist perspective can be found in the discussion right now about the role of digital health and telemedicine that we see discussed all over the world. And the notion, for example, that many governments around the world right now expect its citizens to install apps on their phones to enable contact tracing of infections of the coronavirus. And of course, there's a lot of debates about, well, what about privacy? And all of a sudden, we're now supposed to use these devices with apps that deliberately not only take our data, and we don't know what is happening with that, but the data that gets linked to us as individuals, we are being traced, and we're tracing each other. It's like the perfect nightmare of surveillance conspiracy theories, right? But on the other hand, it is a very powerful way to contain this virus, as examples have shown in South Korea, in Vietnam, in Taiwan, and in parts of China. So there is, I mean, and this debate in and of itself, it can be understood from this functionalist perspective, this expectation that media fulfill a certain function in society. That in and of itself can lead to highly conflictuous debates about whether this is a good or a bad thing, of course. And these debates are very much part and parcel from functionalism. And it's no surprise that as from the 1960s, you really weren't supposed to be a functionalist anymore. But in the last 10 or 20 years or so, this is returning. And in part because studies of media and mass communication are beginning to use perspectives from evolution. cyber psychology, evolutionary psychology, and media psychology and media studies are beginning to collaborate and beginning to appreciate the fact that our bodies and our humanity, our psychology and our media and our technological environment are all intertwined, and they operate and evolve in conjunction. And interesting that a version of functionalism is therefore enjoying somewhat of a resurgence. And I see that very much at work in the debates about telemedicine and those kind of applications at the moment. I'll keep going. I'm almost done. Mirror image. Social constructivism is an important theory that has inspired a lot of research in media studies and communication science from the perspective of looking at our reality not as a reality that's given and that we simply consume, like in the mass society theory, for example, but a reality that is constructed out of the interactions and communications of people. And if you look at reality that way, media, of course, become paramount to study and to understand. What are media saying? What are media events? And how are media events actually becoming real events? In other words, how is our understanding of the world increasingly a mirror of what we see of the world in media? I'll give you an example. Maybe some of you in Lisbon have experienced this as well in versions. I live in Amsterdam part of my life when I work there, when I teach there. And in downtown Amsterdam, you can see tourists only really interested in two things, or maybe three. It's like, where can you get drugs? Where are the sex workers? And where is the Van Gogh Museum? And that's the reality of Amsterdam that they know from brochures, from reports in the media, from stories that people tell about Amsterdam in media. But then, of course, that's not the real Amsterdam. The real Amsterdam is much more diverse and crazy or boring, depending on your perspective. So a constructivist perspective applied to the media suggests that in media we construct a world of our own, and there is a liberating aspect to this, right? It gives us a bit more agency, a bit more, as Castells, I've mentioned him before, would say, communication power. Like, we change reality by using media. Well, that may be an interesting point of view. There are also dark sides, maybe too Star Wars-y as a reference, but think about, for example, what we're doing right now. Think about this whole shift towards online teaching and learning that we're engaged in, where universities and schools all over the world have, from 1 minute to the next, shifted their entire curriculum and course plans and teaching modes to the internet. And we're teaching using Zoom and Skype and Microsoft Hangouts and Google and all those big corporations stepping in, providing these kind of technologies and this kind of software. We're in front of these screens the whole goddamn day. We're supposed to be chatting and interacting and collaborating in online files and documents. There is an enormous expectation that this is not just equally valid as a way of learning and teaching as it is, you know, normally in face-to-face or in the classroom, but perhaps even better in the sense that so many more people can interact, right? That these technologies all are profoundly interactive, and through interaction, we get to learning, right? We learn much more from talking and discussing. I've announced it at the beginning of my talk today, rather than just me lecturing to you. The sage on a stage is not an effective way of teaching. Now, that kind of way of thinking is social constructivist way of thinking. And I wonder if this is true. I'm not saying face-to-face is better than mediated communication. I'm not that naive. I know the studies that show clearly otherwise. I am worried that putting our teaching online is not the same as online learning. And that I wonder if we all really know what we're doing and what the consequences of all of this are. I mean, that said, I'm really excited to be able to talk to and hopefully also with you this way. There are three more perspectives that I want to briefly talk about. One of them is what you would call media deterministic or technology deterministic reading of media and society relationships. The notion that developments in media technology and communication technologies have an impact on, shape the way society evolves. The idea that, for example, the shift from print to broadcast changed the way we interacted with each other and in the world, and the way the world organized itself around us, that the shift from broadcast to online again produced a new change. And right now you see many debates, for example, about whether our societies are becoming platform societies, where most of our interactions are actually now governed by the interfaces and rules of platforms. Our love lives run through Grindr and Tinder. Our homes get organized through Airbnb. Our teaching through Zoom, and so on and so forth. And so that kind of thinking is very much a sort of a media-centric or technology deterministic way of thinking. Has a long history in our field, and it is an important one. And you see it happening right now in debates about what is actually happening on social media, and what are people actually saying on social media about this pandemic. And this is immediately labeled as either really good or really, really bad. And when we focus on the bad, we focus on the xenophobia and racism, hatred that people espouse on social media, blaming foreigners, blaming China, blaming Asians, blaming, and there's a lot of that going on. It's awful, it's disgusting, and it's immediately, well, see what social media does, right? It brings out the worst in people. And then we focus on these same media to something else, namely the incredibly funny, endless variety of digital memes circulating that make us laugh, the support structures that emerge through social media, the fact that you never have to feel alone, how the way people and communities help each other in and outside of social media, and very much organized through social media. Both perspectives, social media as really awful and bad, bringing out the worst in people, and social media as this wonderful source of humor and support and empathy, are examples of this kind of media-centric or deterministic way of thinking about media in society. And it shows how such a theory that was originally coined in the 50s and 60s is still a very powerful trope in how we collectively make sense of the role of media in our lives. I have two more points to make, and then I'll shut up. I recently mentioned the platform society, and in the book we talk about a series of theories that are less deterministic than I just mentioned, but more nuanced in articulating how we've moved to a world right now where the primary form of capital is information, where everything is interconnected, where we live, as Jan van Dijk or Manuel Castells would say, in a network society. And that networks and information are really the key elements that determine most of our interactions and most of the processes that govern the world at the moment, both politically as well as economically. And this is a very powerful range of theories that also have inspired and informed a lot of media and mass communication scholarship. What I find truly fascinating is something I've started my talk with today, which is the parallel development of the pandemic and the infodemic, or disinfodemic, as UNESCO called it. I think the report came out today or yesterday. So the notion that a viral pandemic is equally powerful or dangerous than an infodemic, than the flow of information about it. And I mean, an interesting example of this was a study that came out last week, where scholars in China looked at people's search engine use of search engines like Sina Weibo and Baidu, as well as Google in China in January and February. And they showed that people looking for information about the coronavirus and its symptoms, like pneumonia primarily, preceded the actual infection rate by 1 to 2 weeks. In other words, they say Google could have predicted that this would happen. So they would argue that virality and virology are coincidental, right? They're concurrent developments. Very similar to claims that the pandemic and the infodemic are concurrent and equally dangerous developments that in effect cannot be separated from each other anymore. I think that's very much an idea where functionalism, constructivism, and network society and media determinism or media centrism come together in a way of making sense of what's happening right now in the world. It reminds me of a science fiction book that I tremendously enjoy that some of you may or may not know. It appeared in 1992 and is generally credited as the first science fiction book that really explored cyberspace or virtual worlds. It's called Snow Crash. It was written by Neil Stephenson. Actually, the founders of Google often said they were inspired by Neil Stephenson for some of Google's functionalities. The builders of Wikipedia is the same way. So this book was a really important book. In the book called Snow Crash from 1992, what happens is a society lives in reality as well as in a metaverse, a virtual world. And the plot of the book is about a virus that is on the point of being released. And the virus is so powerful that it doesn't just affect people in the metaverse, in other words, their avatars and their computers, but also their bodies in reality. So they get sick and they all become programmable, or programs, if you will. And so this is a beautiful sort of science fiction version of something that's actually happening right now, where something that happens in our bodies has a concurrence in what happens in our media. And to me, it testifies once more that when we study the media mass communication, we study the real world. And then when we want to understand the real world, we also have to understand the media. And that there is no separation between these two. And that insight leads me to the last media society theory that we talk about in the book, and that has been coined in the last 20 years or so by media scholars. And finally, a theory that comes from media scholars and not just from sociologists or political scientists or those wonderful colleagues. And the theory of mediatization is actually a very simple theory. Some people would argue it's more like a sensitizing perspective rather than a fully fledged theory. But it makes a very simple but powerful assumption. It suggests, on the one hand, that media have become an incredibly powerful institution in society that we cannot ignore. And on the other hand, that if you want to function in any way in society, you have to, at the very least, also function effectively in media. So there is a dual process happening where media companies and corporations and what happens in movies and who gets covered and quoted in the news and whose music gets promoted on the radio all have a profound influence in our culture and our way of life and the way societies function. And at the same time, all of us, including us as individuals and politicians and companies, can only effectively function in society by functioning effectively in media, right? If we don't spend 20 million euros on an election campaign with ads on television, we won't get elected, even though nobody watches television anymore. That's mediatization of politics right there. And you could argue, in conclusion, that the coronavirus pandemic is a mediatized phenomenon. Right? It's a phenomenon that exists and plays out as much in media as it plays out in our bodies. It is a parallel process that occurs in conjunction. I mean, the UNESCO report that appeared today or yesterday goes as far to say that the way we consume information about the pandemic online can be fatal, right? But people, for example, buying into false cures by taking ridiculous types of medicines, or by attacking and burning down 5G masts and those kind of things. So there's a very real sort of mediatization element going on here. And mediatization in that sense has a lot to say. And I would predict that a lot of studies will be developing right now and coming out in the next couple of years about the coronavirus pandemic as a mediatized phenomenon. And I think that kind of sums up the different ways in which media and mass comm scholarship can really say something about even the tiniest processes happening right now in the context of this pandemic. I will conclude before we have a conversation with each other, I hope, with something about what we're doing at the moment, because you know, we're all, I'm assuming, sitting at home, watching this lecture and this discussion, participating in it, thinking about it, but what are we actually all doing at home? Because this device that we have in front of us, whether it's your phone or a tablet or a desktop computer, a laptop computer, or maybe your smart television that is connected to the internet, is now a device for learning and teaching, right? It's a device of school. And then perhaps later on tonight, a couple of hours from now, I will be talking on the same device and the same platform with one of my former colleagues and one of my best friends in Indiana, where I used to work and teach. And we're going to hang out and have a beer. And earlier today, I was having a meeting with my colleagues because I'm the director of graduate studies at the University of Amsterdam. So we have a lot of managerial issues. So I was at work and doing my management stuff. And then I watched somebody on Zoom teaching me how to bake a certain type of fish that I want to make for my family tonight. And so social theorists have been arguing for a while that one of the key elements of contemporary living is a convergence of different spheres of life, right? As our jobs become more precarious and the 9-to-5 world is beginning to disappear, our different domains of everyday life, of school and of private life and of public life, of work life, of cultural life, are beginning to sort of blend. And now we're all at home. And we're experiencing all these different lives simultaneously through the screen, right? Media have truly become, I mean, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Media Life, and it was a funny theoretical exercise, but by God, this has become very, very real. How literally our entire lives are now sucked into media. Not just that, but at the same time, in the same place, at home, where we're stuck. Right? And so many people, maybe you've experienced as well, have complained online when I look at the debates about feeling exhausted, more exhausted than ever before, even though we get to lie in the morning and unless you have kids, of course. And I think a lot of this has to do with our media lives right now, with the convergence, the mixing of all these different roles we play in life. Right? The role of student, of teacher, of worker, of friend, of lover, of colleague, of father, of daughter, and so on and so forth. They're all parallel, happening at the same time. They're like different tabs in our internet browser. And if anything, what that should tell us is that we should be incredibly forgiving towards ourselves and others about what we're doing. We shouldn't ask so much of ourselves, of being really good students or really good teachers or really good anything at the moment. Because these roles are now a big soup. They're in a media blender. And that is hard enough as it is when you're playing any of one of these roles, but somebody reminding you of another role comes in through your phone. But now it happens all the friggin' time. And we can't go out, literally. We can't get out. So I hope that both gives us pause in terms of the realization that media really matter, as well as gives us pause that, you know, we're okay as we are. We're doing more than enough, perhaps way too much in all these roles. We can't play them all perfectly, and that's just fine. So I hope that contributes a little bit to your understanding of what's going on, or raises some interesting questions or thoughts. Thanks for listening to me. I talked way too much, but I really enjoyed it, and I hope you had some fun too. And please open it up for discussions.